Picture this. A country church on a bright, cold morning in March, packed to the back wall, every family of consequence for 30 miles crushed into the pews in their best, the font uncovered, the water blessed. A 6-week-old boy asleep in a christening gown of Brussels lace that 4 generations of the same family have been carried to that font in. Picture a duchess standing at the font with her son in her arms, and picture the moment she looks up over the rector's shoulder at the front pew on the left-hand side of the aisle, the pew her grandfather bought and her mother sat in every Sunday of her married life, and she has sat in every Sunday of hers, and sees that it is occupied. Not by her husband. Her husband is beside her at the font, in a coat the colour of claret, looking pleased. The pew is occupied by a woman of about 28 in a green pelisse with sable at the throat, sitting exactly in the centre of the bench with her gloved hands folded, who has never in her life been introduced to a single person in that church, and who is looking straight at the Duchess with the smallest possible smile, and who has been put there deliberately and seated by the Duke's own hand, not 4 minutes earlier in front of 200 people. And now picture the sound. Because there was a sound, and everyone who was in St. Bride's at Ainsdale on the 9th of March remembered it for the rest of their lives. And it was not a gasp, and it was not a whisper. It was the sound of one man standing up. If this is the kind of story you stay for, do me a kindness before we go on. Tell me in the comments where in the world you are listening from tonight, because I read them and it astonishes me every time. Give this a like if you believe that some debts get paid in full, and subscribe, because I am telling one of these every few days now, and you will not want to miss what happens at the assizes at the end of this one. Now let us go back. Because to understand a woman who walked out of a church without changing her expression, you must first understand what she had already been carrying for 6 years. The Duchess of Harrogate had been Charlotte Ashby, and the Ashbys were not nobody. They were, in fact, considerably more than nobody in every way that keeps a family fed. Her grandfather had built the first of the Ainsdale mills in 1779. Her father had built 4 more and a bank in Leeds to finance them. And by the time Charlotte was 19, the Ashby name on a note of hand was better in the north of England than the name of any earl you could name. What the Ashbys did not have was a coronet, and Josiah Ashby wanted one the way some men want a son. So, in the spring of 1808, he bought one. The 6th Duke of Harrogate was 31, handsome in a heavy, indolent way, and possessed of 40,000 acres, 1,100 a year of income, and 19,000 pounds of debt that his father had been servicing by the simple method of not thinking about it. The terms were written down. Charlotte's marriage portion was £60,000, which cleared the debt, restored the roof at Harrogate, and left something over. The 3 Ainsdale mills that had come to Charlotte directly from her grandfather's will were settled on her separately, in trust, in her own name, which was unusual, and which her father's attorney had insisted on in the face of considerable irritation from the Harrogate side, and which is the single most important sentence in this entire story, so hold on to it. She was 22. Nobody asked her. She has said since that she went into it with her eyes open and no illusions, and that the only thing that surprised her was how long it took her to stop hoping anyway. Because she did hope. That is the part that people who tell this story in the North always leave out, because it does not fit the picture of the cold, clever woman who ruined a duke. For the first 2 years she hoped. She learned his estate the way she had learned her father's mills, because it was the only way she knew to love anything, and by the second winter she knew the Harrogate rent roll better than the man who collected it. She reorganized the home farm. She found £1,100 a year in a timber contract that had been renewed on the same terms since 1791. She wrote to the tenants herself, in her own hand, every one of the 84 of them, and when the Dunn family's roof went in, she sent a man and a cart the same day. And she did all of it hoping, in a way she never once said out loud, that at some point her husband would come into a room, look at what she had done, and say something. He never did. He was not cruel in those years. That is worth being precise about, because the story is more useful if it is true. He was polite at breakfast, absent by supper, agreeable at Christmas, and entirely uninterested. He thanked her for things in the tone a man uses to thank a servant who has done well. And she learned by inches over 6 years not to offer her opinion in company, because when she did, he would smile and say, "My wife has views on drainage," and the table would laugh, and he would look pleased at having been amusing. She stopped. By the 4th year she had gone quiet in public, and by the 5th even the servants had noticed that the Duchess said nothing at table, and it was assumed in the county that she was stupid, or timid, or northern, and she let all 3 assumptions stand, because none of them cost her anything, and correcting them would have. I want you to sit with what those 6 years were actually made of, because the size of what she did later is only visible against the smallness of what she endured first. It was not beatings. It was not a locked door. It was a woman coming down to breakfast at 8 and finding a note that said her husband had gone up to town and would be back on Thursday, and then finding on Thursday. That Thursday had meant the Thursday of the following week. It was ordering dinner for 211 days a year and eating it alone 11 times out of 12. It was learning, in the second winter, that if she wanted to know where he was, she should ask the second footman rather than ask him, because the second footman would tell her the truth and her husband would tell her whatever was least trouble. It was writing to him at Christmas of 1810 a letter of 4 pages about the timber contract, the £1,100 she had found, and what she thought might be done with it for the Ainsdale cottages, and receiving in reply, 11 days later, a single sheet that said, "My dear Charlotte, do as you think best. I have taken a box for the season. You will want gowns. T. Do as you think best." She read it, she has said, about 20 times, hunting through 9 words for one that was addressed to her rather than to the office she performed, and there was not one. And she put it in the writing case and went on. And it was, above all, the slow, silent business of being edited. She had come to that house at 22 with opinions, a laugh that was too loud for the county, and the northern habit of saying the sum out loud. By 26 she had none of the 3. Nobody had ever told her to stop. That is what people misunderstand about how it happens. Nobody ever tells you. You simply learn. From a smile at the wrong moment, and a laugh in the wrong direction, and the particular way a room's attention slides off you when you begin a sentence, that you are a subject on which the company would rather not dwell, and you are a polite woman, and so you oblige. She obliged for 6 years. She used to say afterward that the loneliest thing in her life had not been the empty dining room, which she had grown to rather enjoy, but the moment at any large dinner when somebody asked a question about cloth or credit or water, and she knew the answer exactly and could feel it sitting in her mouth, and said nothing, and watched three men who did not know get it wrong for 20 minutes. That is the woman. Now the other two. Miss Delphine Sayer arrived in the county in the autumn of 1812 as a guest, then as a tenant of the Dower House at Kelby, which is 4 miles from Harrogate, and which nobody had lived in for 11 years. She was the widow of a wine merchant, or she said she was. The marriage certificate was never produced, and by the time anybody thought to ask for it, the question had stopped being interesting. She was charming in the way that costs nothing and takes everything. She remembered names. She was funny about people who could not hear her, and she had the particular talent of making a man feel that the two of them were the only clever people in a room full of fools. She wanted the Duke of Harrogate the way a person wants a good horse. Not to keep, to have. And she took the county first, which is the detail that tells you she had done this before. She did not begin with him. She began with the 4 women whose approval decided everything within 30 miles, and she began with the most difficult of them, and she spent an entire autumn being useful, charming, and slightly self-deprecating about her own circumstances, and by Christmas of 1812 there were 3 houses in that county where it was understood that Mrs. Sayer was a great acquisition, and that it was a shame she was so much alone at Kelby. When she finally allowed herself to be placed next to the Duke of Harrogate at a dinner in January, half the table had already been prepared over 11 weeks to find the pairing charming. She was very good at this. She was better at it than anyone the Duchess of Harrogate had ever encountered. And Charlotte, who could read a balance sheet at a glance, watched it happen across 4 months with the cold interest of a professional watching a professional, and understood exactly what was being done, and could not stop 1 hour of it, because there was no instrument. You cannot serve a notice on charm. What she also understood, and what Delphine Sayer never once suspected, was the shape of the cruelty. Delphine's cruelty always required an audience and was always deniable. She never said a rude thing to the Duchess of Harrogate in her life. What she did was arrive 4 minutes late to a house where the Duchess was expected, so that the 2 arrivals blurred. What she did was admire, loudly, at a public assembly the Duchess's gown, and then ask, with enormous warmth, whether it was one of the older ones, because she did so admire a woman who was not a slave to the season. What she did, in April of 1813, at a garden party at Ray Hall in front of 9 people, was put her hand on Charlotte's arm and say, "You must be so relieved to have all this taken off your hands." 9 people heard it. Every one of them understood it. Not one of them could have repeated it as an insult, and that was the whole art. Mr. Ambrose Fitch had been the Duke's man of business since the old Duke's time, and Fitch is the one you should be watching, though nobody in this story watched him until it was almost too late. He was 54, dry, deferential, extremely hard-working, and he had been quietly stealing from Harrogate for 9 years by the time Delphine Sayer came into the county. Small at first, a percentage on the timber, a fictitious drainage contractor, 2 tenancies collected and never entered. He was clever and patient, and he had one enormous advantage, which was that his employer had never in his life read a column of figures to the bottom. And when Delphine arrived, Fitch did not compete with her. He recognized her. They came to an arrangement within 4 months, and the arrangement was this. She would keep the Duke amused, expensive and looking the other way, and Fitch would see that the money to keep her so was found, and that a good deal more than the necessary amount was found, and that the difference went where it went. It was Fitch who first suggested to the Duke that the Ainsdale rents might be paid into the Kelby account for convenience. It was Fitch who drew the deed of gift by which the Harrogate sapphires went to a house 4 miles away. And it was Fitch, and this is the thing that should have warned everybody, who first put into the Duke's head the idea that the mills were his. So the violations began, and they were material, and they were graded, and they went on for 14 months, and the Duchess of Harrogate wrote every one of them down. The sapphires in November of 1812 warned to the Kelby Assembly in December, where 4 people saw them and 3 of them wrote to somebody about it. The green carriage in February, which had been Charlotte's mother's and had her mother's monogram on the door, and which was returned in April with the monogram taken off and a new one put on, badly, in cheaper paint. In July, £800 moved out of the estate account and into an account at a Leeds bank in the name of a Mr. A. Fitch, which Charlotte found because she still, out of 6 years of habit, read the estate passbook every quarter. In September, the Ainsdale rents. In November, a letter left on a hall table, not by accident, in which Delphine Sayer wrote to the Duke of Harrogate that she had been at Kelby a year now and did not intend to spend a second year being a secret, and that there were arrangements to be made, and that she cannot possibly mind. She has the mills. She has the mills. Charlotte read that sentence standing in her own hall with her coat still on. She read it 3 times. And then she folded the letter and put it in her pocket and went upstairs and sat down at her writing desk and did not weep and did not go and find her husband and did not do a single one of the things that the story wanted her to do. What she did was take out a fresh quarto notebook and write on the first page in her ordinary hand Ainsdale Accounts 1812 and underneath it the date, and underneath that 1. Sapphires, November, deed of gift drawn by A.F. obtain copy. She was 6 weeks from her confinement. Her son was born on the 28th of January, and he was a large, healthy boy. And he was the 9th vein in direct line, and the Duke of Harrogate was genuinely, uncomplicatedly delighted, and came into the room and kissed his wife's hand and said, "Well done, my dear, well done indeed." And Charlotte looked up at him from the pillow and understood, with total clarity and no particular pain, that he had no idea she had stopped loving him 14 months ago. And then he went out, and she lay in the dark with her son, and she did the arithmetic that every woman in her position eventually does at 3 in the morning, which is the arithmetic of staying. She could stay. That was the honest first column. She could stay and be a duchess and be quietly humiliated at 4 assemblies a year and raise her boy in a warm house with 80 servants. And Delphine Sayer would be gone within 3 years, because women like that are always gone within 3 years, and there would be another one and another after that, and it would be perfectly survivable, and no one in England would think the worse of her for choosing it. And the second column was 1 line long, and the line was Henry, because a boy raised in that house would learn, without a single word being said to him, exactly what she had learned in 6 years, that his mother was a subject the company would rather not dwell on. He would learn it from the footman, and from the way conversation moved around her at table, and by the time he was 9 he would know it, and by the time he was 15 he would be doing it himself, because children copy what is done, not what is said. She was not going to hand her son a mother he could be faintly embarrassed by. She named the boy Henry for her grandfather. And she chose his godfather herself, which is a wife's right, and she chose a man her husband had met twice and did not think about, and that choice, made in an hour, from a bed, in the middle of the night, while the house slept, turned out to be the hinge on which everything else swung. Miss Stephen Roe built ships at Whitby. He was 36, plainly dressed, blunt and rich in the unshowy way of men whose money is all in things you can touch. He had known the Ashbys all his life because his father had built the hulls that carried Ashby cloth, and he had come to Ainsdale at 18 and again at 19, and on the second occasion, in the garden of the Ashby house at Leeds, he had asked Josiah Ashby for his daughter's hand, and Josiah Ashby had laughed. Not unkindly. That was the worst of it. He had laughed the way a man laughs at a boy who has asked for something out of season, and he had said, "Stephen, she is going to be a countess at least," and had given him a glass of wine and talked about freight. Roe had not mentioned it again to anyone for 17 years. There is one more thing about Stephen Roe, and it does not become important until the assizes, so I will put it here and leave it. His mother had been a Marchmont, and by 1813 there were exactly 2 lives between Stephen Roe of Whitby and the earldom of Ardvale, and one of them was 81 and the other was a consumptive boy of 9, and Roe knew this perfectly well and had never in his life referred to it, because he considered it, in his own words, a thing that may happen to me, like the gout. Now, the 9th of March, Saint, brides at Ainsdale, and 200 people, because a ducal christening in that county was an event, and because the Ashby mills were in that parish and every mill family in Ainsdale had turned out to see Josiah Ashby's grandson made a Christian. The Duchess came in with the child and the nurse. Her own pew, front left, had been kept for the family, as it had been kept for 40 years. And at 11 minutes past 11, in full view of the church, the Duke of Harrogate came down the aisle with Miss Delphine Sayer on his arm, walked her to the front, handed her into the Ashby pew, saw her seated, arranged her skirts for her with his own hand, and said, not quietly, because he had had 3 glasses of something before leaving the house, and because it had genuinely not occurred to him that this was anything, "There you will see everything from here." 200 people watched him do it. The Dowager Duchess Margaret, seated across the aisle, went absolutely still. Mrs. Kites, the housekeeper, standing at the back with the upper servants, put her hand over her mouth. And the Duchess of Harrogate, at the font, with her son in her arms, looked at the pew for perhaps 2 seconds, and then looked at the rector, and said, in a perfectly level voice, "Shall we begin?" They began. And they got as far as the naming of the godparents, and the rector said, "And who stands as godfather to this child?" And Stephen Roe stood up. He was in the second pew on the right. He stood up, and he did not look at the rector, and he did not look at the Duchess. He turned and looked at the Duke of Harrogate for about 4 seconds, and then he said clearly to the whole church, "I cannot stand for the boy in this. I am sorry. Not to you, madam, never to you." And he walked out, down the full length of the aisle, past the Ashby pew, past 200 people, and out through the west door, and the door was heavy and it did not slam, it simply closed, and the sound it made was the sound the whole county talked about for a year. The christening was completed. The rector, a brave man, sent the verger to fetch a second godfather out of the congregation, and old Dr. Ray stood in, and the child was baptized Henry Josiah Vane. And the Duchess of Harrogate held her son through all of it with an expression that 3 separate people afterward described in almost identical words, like a woman listening to a sermon in a language she did not speak. She did not look at the pew again, not once. The churchyard afterward was the worst part, and she had known it would be. There is no crueler 10 minutes in English life than the 10 minutes outside a church when 200 people who have all just seen the same thing must file past the injured party and say something about the weather. They did it. Every one of them did it. And she stood at the gate in the March wind with her son and her husband 4 feet away, and she shook 11 pairs of hands. And the Mill families came past last because they always came past last, and old Sarah Dunn stopped in front of her, 72 years old, 4'11", and did not say anything about the weather. She looked at the Duchess of Harrogate, and she said, "Ainsdale saw that, Your Grace." And then she went on. 6 words. Charlotte Vane thought about those 6 words, on and off, for the next 31 years. And when she came to build the school in 1822, she put the Dunn name on the deed of trust, and never explained why to anybody, including the Dunns. At the door she shook hands with the rector and thanked him for the address, and she asked after his wife's chest, and she remembered the name of his wife's chest complaint. And then she got into the carriage with her son and went home, and she went upstairs, and she took out the quarto notebook, and she wrote under the 29th entry 30. 9 March. St. Bride's. DS seated in Ashby Pew by T himself before approx. 200 witnesses inkle. Dow, Duchess, Rector, Ainsdale Mill families. Mr. Rowe withdrew as Godfather, stating cause aloud. And then, beneath it, on a fresh line, the only sentence in the entire notebook that was not a record of a fact: enough. Once, completely, and never again. Here is what a woman does when she decides to act once and completely, and it is not what novels tell you. She does not confront anybody. Charlotte Vane understood, with the clarity of somebody who had grown up watching her father's bank take people apart, that an accusation without proof is a gift to a guilty man, because it tells him exactly what to burn. So she said nothing at all. For 11 weeks she was, to every appearance, precisely what she had been for 6 years, quiet at table, correct with her husband, invisible, and underneath it she assembled a case. And there was one conversation in those 11 weeks that she never wrote down and never told anybody about, except at the very end of her life, her granddaughter. On the evening of the christening, at about 10 o'clock, her husband came to her sitting room. He had been drinking, but not badly, and he was in that expansive, apologetic humour that costs a man nothing. And he stood by the fire and said that the thing at the church had been awkward, and that Rowe had made a great fool of himself and would regret it, and that Delphine had been mortified, actually mortified, and had wanted him to say so. Charlotte was at her desk with the quarto notebook shut under her blotter. She said, "Was she?" "She was," he said. "You must not think there was anything meant by it, Charlotte. There was nothing meant by it at all." And she looked at him then, and she has said that this was the exact second, not the pew, not the church, not the closing of the door, but this second, at 10 o'clock at night by her own fire, when the last of 6 years of hope went out of her like a candle in a draught, because he was telling the truth. There had been nothing meant by it. He had walked another woman into her mother's pew on the day of her son's christening in front of 200 people, and he had not meant anything by it, because meaning something by it would have required him to have some idea that she was there. She said, "I see." He said, "Good girl," and kissed her forehead and went to bed and slept extremely well. And downstairs his wife took the notebook out from under the blotter and worked until 2 in the morning. She began with Mrs. Kites. She went down to the housekeeper's room one evening in April with the household books as an excuse, and she sat down, and after 10 minutes of accounts she said, "Mrs. Kites, I am going to ask you a question, and you may refuse to answer it, and nothing will follow." And Mrs. Kites, who was 59 and had been in that house since she was 14 and had spent 6 years watching a good woman be quietly erased, said, "You'll want the drawer, Your Grace." There was a drawer. There is always a drawer. In it were 11 letters between the Duke and Delphine Sayer that had come into the house by hand and been left about and been tidied away and never asked for. 4 notes from Fitch to Delphine that should never have gone through the Harrogate post at all, and a memorandum in Fitch's hand on Harrogate paper listing the Ainsdale rent payments for 3 quarters with a column at the right, headed only with the letter S. Then Mr. Bree. Bree was 26, a clerk at the Leeds branch of the bank her father had built, and Charlotte wrote to him not as a duchess, but as C. Ashby, and asked for duplicates of the statements of one particular account for 4 years, Anne Bree, who had been told by his manager that the account was not to be discussed, sat up 2 nights copying them by hand and sent them, and enclosed with them, unasked, a note that said, "Your Grace will observe that the payments in the 3rd column do not correspond to any contractor known to the bank. I have taken the liberty of listing the dates. I am at your service, and I do not require anything." He got a partnership out of it in 1819 and deserved it. And she had to do all of it in a house where she was still, every morning, the Duchess of Harrogate, and where the man she was assembling a case against sat opposite her at breakfast 4 days a week. That is the part that people who have never done it cannot imagine. Not the courage of the thing, but the housekeeping of it. She had 11 weeks of asking her husband pleasantly whether he would be at home on Thursday, because she needed to know which day she could have the estate books out on the table for 6 hours. She had 11 weeks of writing letters that could not be seen and receiving letters that could not be left about, and she solved that by having everything directed to the Ainsdale mill office in the name of the mill's clerk, who was 63 and asked no questions and put the packets into her hands at the Sunday inspection. She had 11 weeks of being in the same room as Ambrose Fitch, who came up to Harrogate every 2nd Tuesday, and of saying good morning to him, and of once, in July, asking him a mild question about the timber, and watching him answer it fluently and completely falsely, and thanking him and writing it down that evening. She did not enjoy any of it. She has been very clear about that in the one letter where she discussed it. People imagine it was satisfying, she wrote in 1841. It was 11 weeks of nausea. I was afraid every day. Not of him, of being wrong. A woman in my position gets exactly 1 attempt, and if I had moved a week early with 9/10 of it, I should have been the Mad Duchess for the rest of my life, and Ainsdale would have gone. Then the tenants, who cost her nothing but courtesy, because she had been writing to 84 of them in her own hand for 6 years, and had sent a cart to the Duns. And when she asked 11 of them in June whether they had received any communication about their leases, 9 of them wrote back within a week, and 4 of them enclosed the communication, which was a printed notice on Harrogate paper signed A. Fitch, informing them that their tenancies were terminated at Michaelmas and that new terms would be offered. The Duke had never seen it. Then the Dowager. This is the one nobody in the county expected. Margaret, Dowager Duchess of Harrogate, was 67, had never once in 6 years said a kind word to her daughter-in-law, and had made her opinion of the marriage plain at the wedding breakfast in 1808 by referring to it, in front of 40 people, as the arrangement. Charlotte went to her in July with the notebook, and put it on the table, and said, "Madam, I am not asking you to like me. I am telling you what your son's man of business has done to your husband's estate, and I am going to stop it, and it will be public. You may be beside me, or you may be in the account, but you will not be able to be neither." Margaret Vane read the notebook for 40 minutes without speaking. Then she said, "The sapphires were my mother's." And then she said, "What do you require?" And Charlotte said, "Your presence in the room. Nothing else. Your presence in the room is worth 11 witnesses." She had it. And then, in August, Fitch overreached, as they always do, because the money had made him confident and Delphine had made him greedy. He went for the mills. The instrument he used was a deed of appointment, drawn in 1808. In which, he claimed, the trust over the 3 Ainsdale mills had been varied to permit the trustees to convey at the direction of the husband, and he produced it, and it was witnessed, and it was dated the 12th of June 1808, 11 days before the marriage, and it was very good work. It was so good that the Duke's own council believed it. It was served on Charlotte's trustees on the 14th of August 1813, and the covering letter, which Fitch wrote himself, and which Delphine certainly read before it went, informed the trustees that His Grace intended to realise the Ainsdale property, and that instructions as to the disposal of the proceeds would follow. 1,240 people worked in those 3 mills. Charlotte received the papers at 4 in the afternoon. She read them twice. And then she rang the bell and asked for the carriage and went to Whitby, which is 41 miles, and she did it in 1 day. And she arrived at Stephen Roe's yard at 9 in the evening, covered in dust. And Roe came out of the counting-house in his shirt-sleeves and stopped dead. She said, "Mr. Roe, I need a man who can read a forged instrument and does not care what happens to him socially. My father said you were the best judge of a document he ever met, and then he laughed at you in a garden, and I have been ashamed of him for 17 years, and I am here anyway, because I have 1,200 people and 4 days. Stephen Roe looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Come in out of the yard, it's going to rain." She had not eaten since Ainsdale. He put her in a chair in the counting-house, with the rain starting on the window, and went out and came back with bread and cold beef and a pot of tea, and set it down in front of a duchess without apologizing for it, and then took the papers to the far end of the long table under the lamp, and left her entirely alone for an hour and a half. Which was, she said afterward, the single most restful hour and a half of her adult life. Nobody had left her alone in 6 years. They had ignored her, which is a different thing and takes something from you. Being ignored is a small, continuous demand that you make yourself smaller. Being left alone is a gift. He found it in 90 minutes. The deed of appointment of the 12th of June 1808 was witnessed by two men, one of whom was a clerk called Sowerby, who had died in 1806, which was clumsy but not fatal, and one of whom was Fitch's own brother-in-law, which was worse. But the thing that hanged it was the paper. Rowe held it to the lamp and found the watermark, and the watermark was a Whatman, with the date 1811 in it, because Whatman had begun dating their paper, and no instrument executed in June of 1808 could be written on paper made 3 years later. He put it down and said, "This was drawn last month. Madam, this man is going to be transported. What followed took 4 months, and I am going to give it to you plainly, because the pleasure of this part is in the order of it. First, the trustees, on Rowe's affidavit, refused the deed and lodged the forgery with the magistrates. Second, the magistrates, one of whom was the member for the county and had been at the christening, granted a warrant. Third, Fitch, arrested at Harrogate on the 11th of September in the estate office, with the Duke standing in the doorway asking what on earth was happening, turned in the carriage on the way to York and began in the manner of his kind to talk, and what he talked about for 2 hours was Miss Delphine Sayer and the arrangement and the letters and the dates. And fourth, and this is the part that broke Theodore Vane, because up to that morning he had genuinely believed himself to be a man having an affair rather than a man being farmed. Fourth, the accounts were opened at the assizes at York on the 4th of January 1814 and read aloud. 9 years. £19,411 from the estate of Harrogate into the hands of Ambrose Fitch, of which something over 6,000 had gone to Kelby. A duke who could not say, when asked directly by counsel, what the annual income of his own estate was. A tenant, done on the stand for 11 minutes, saying that he had had a notice to quit signed by Mr. Fitch, and that he had written to her Grace, and her Grace had answered him in 3 days in her own hand. And could he say that? Because he wanted it said. And the 11 letters, read into the record by a clerk with an excellent flat voice, including the one that said, "She cannot possibly mind. She has the mills." I want to give you the second day at York properly, because the second day was hers, and she was not even called. Counsel for the prosecution was a Leeds man named Verity, who had been retained by the trustees and briefed over 3 evenings by a duchess with a quarto notebook, and Verity was not a graceful advocate, but he had one great gift, which was that he understood that a document read slowly is more frightening than a speech. So on the second morning he did not make a speech. He stood up and said that he proposed to read the estate accounts of Harrogate for the years 1804 to 1813, and that he was sorry, and that it would take some time. And he read them, column by column, quarter by quarter, in a flat Yorkshire voice, for 2 hours and 40 minutes, and the court, which had come for scandal, sat in complete silence while a man read out numbers, because by the 40th minute every person in that room had begun to be able to do the arithmetic themselves, and to see the shape rising out of it like a wreck coming up out of water. Drainage at Kelby Low, £84, paid quarterly to a contractor with no address for 9 years. The timber renewed at the 1791 rate for 22 years, with the difference between the 1791 rate and the market rate going from 1806 into a Leeds account. And then the Ainsdale rents, 3/4 of them, £790, entered in the estate book in Fitch's hand, and traced by Mr. Bree's duplicates into an account from which, 11 days later, £300 had gone to a milliner at Ripon. That was the moment. Verity put the paper down and said, "My lord, the Duchess of Harrogate's tenants paid their rents in good faith to their landlord in the November quarter of 1812. £411 of that money bought a green pelisse and a sable tippet, and the rest of it bought nothing that anybody in this court can point to. I am obliged to observe that the tenants have not been credited." Then he called Theodore Vane. That was Charlotte's decision, and her attorney had argued against it for 2 days, and she had overruled him with one sentence. He has to hear himself say it. The Duke of Harrogate was in the box for 55 minutes, and he was not hostile, and he was not clever, and he did not once try to save himself, and that is the only thing in this entire story that any person ever said in his favour. Verity asked him what the annual net income of the Harrogate estate had been in 1812. He said he did not know. Verity asked him whether he had read the deed of gift by which his wife's sapphires were conveyed. He said he had signed it. Verity asked whether he had read it. He said, after a pause, no. Verity asked him who had told him that the Ainsdale rents should be paid into the Kelby account, and he said, Mr. Fitch Verity asked whether it had struck him as odd, and the Duke of Harrogate said, into a silent court, "Nothing about my own affairs has struck me as anything for a very long time, sir. That is the whole of what I have done." The court was full. The Dowager Duchess of Harrogate sat in the second row for all 4 days, in black, upright, and did not once look at her son. Ambrose Fitch got 14 years' transportation and sailed in the June. He died at Port Jackson in 1821, and nobody in England noticed. Miss Delphine Sayer was not charged, because there was nothing to charge her with that would stick, and this is the part where people always want blood and do not get it, and I want you to see why it did not matter. What happened to Delphine Sayer was arithmetic. The Kelby lease was in the Duke's name, and it was surrendered in the February. Her credit in 3 counties, which had never been credit at all, but only the reflected credit of Harrogate, closed inside a month. The milliner at Ripon, who had carried her for £200, sued and was paid at 4 shillings in the pound. She went to Bath in the spring of 1814 and did there exactly what she had done at Kelby, and it worked for 11 months. And then a man's sister made some inquiries and wrote to a friend in Yorkshire, and the friend wrote back at length. She was 31. She lived until 1849 in Boulogne on £110 a year, and she was, by every account of the 2 or 3 people who knew her there, extremely good company and entirely alone, which was precisely the future she had designed for herself the day she decided that people were things you had rather than kept. And the Duke of Harrogate. He came to her at the Leeds house on the 9th of February, 5 weeks after the assizes, without sending word, and stood in the middle of her father's drawing-room in a coat that no longer fitted him, and said the only genuinely honest thing he said in this entire story, and I will give it to you as the shorthand writer's clerk who was present for the deposition took it down. Because she had a clerk present. Because she had learned. He said, "I am not going to ask you to forgive me, because I have worked out at last that forgiveness is a thing people ask for to make themselves comfortable, and I would rather be uncomfortable and accurate. I did not know about Fitch. That is not a defence. I did not know because I did not look, and I did not look because looking is work, and every single thing that man took, he took through the hole where my attention should have been. And I knew about the pew. I want that on your paper. Nobody made me do that. I walked that woman down your grandfather's church and put her in your mother's seat in front of your own people on the day of your son's christening. And I did it because it amused me to be looked at, and because I had stopped some years ago being able to see you at all. You were there for 6 years. I have been going back over it and I cannot find you. There is a whole woman in my house for 6 years and I cannot find her. That is what I have to live with, and I am aware that it is not the worst thing in this room to have to live with, and I will go now. She let him finish. Then she said, "Thank you. That was well said, and I believe you meant it. And then here are the terms, and they are not negotiable, and my attorney will send them tomorrow, so you need not remember them. There will be a separation. It will be by private deed, not by act, because an act would put Henry in the newspapers, and I will not have that for him. You will retain the title, the house, and the land, all of which are entailed, and none of which I want. You will not retain the Ainsdale mills, which were never yours, or my portion, £60,000 which will be repaid over 11 years out of the timber and the rents, and the schedule is in the deed, and it is not generous, but it is possible. And if you keep to it, you will end your life solvent, which is more than your father managed. Henry will live with me until he is 12. You will see him 4 times a year, and you will not once, in the whole of his childhood, say one word against me to him, and if you do, I will know within a fortnight. And you will not come back, not in a year, not in 10. Not when you are ill, not when you are sorry, not on the day he marries. You had 6 years of a person who would have given you everything she had, and you could not be troubled to learn her, and there is no second allocation of that. This is not revenge, Theodore. Revenge would require me to still be thinking about you. This is only the correct entry. He kept to it. That is the strange coda that the county never quite knew what to do with. Theodore Vane paid the 60,000 back over 9 years, not 11, went nowhere, entertained nobody, gave up the horses, learned the rent roll of his own estate at the age of 39, and made himself, by about 1825, into a genuinely competent and completely joyless landlord who was respected by his tenants and liked by nobody. He never remarried. He saw his son 4 times a year and sent him back on time. He was at Henry's wedding in 1838 and sat well back, and left before the breakfast, and Henry, who was a kind young man, went out to the carriage after him, and what his father said to him there, Henry never repeated to anybody but his mother, and she never repeated it at all. He died in 1841. And Charlotte. She took back the 3 Ainsdale mills in the March of 1814 and ran them herself for 31 years. She built the 4th in 1819 and the school in 1822, and she paid for the school out of the mills and not out of a subscription, because a subscription, she said, lets 40 people feel generous about one building. 1,240 people became 1,900. In the bad winter of 1826, she ran all 4 mills at half-time rather than close one, and lost £4,000 doing it, and there were men in Ainsdale in 1870 who could still tell you what their grandmothers had said about that winter. She wore black to nothing, kept no dogs, was thought hard by people who did not know her, and something close to holy by the 1,100 families who did. And she was, for about 6 years, entirely alone, and by every account of that period, including her own, perfectly content. There is one thing left to tell about the 6 years alone, and it is the part I like best. In the autumn of 1816, the Duchess of Harrogate, she kept the title, because it was Henry's mother's title and dropping it would have been a statement and she had finished making statements, was asked to a dinner at Ray Hall. The first large dinner she had been asked to since the assizes, and she went. And she was seated near the bottom of the table, because nobody quite knew what she was any more. And at some point in the second course a man 3 places up said something confidently wrong about the price of raw cotton and the effect of the American business on it, and the table agreed with him, and the old feeling came up in her, the sentence sitting in her mouth, 6 years of practice at swallowing it. And she looked at it, and she thought, quite distinctly, there is no longer any reason on earth for me to do this. So she put down her fork and she said, "Forgive me, that is not right." And then she talked for 4 minutes with figures about cotton. And when she had finished there was the particular silence of a table that has just discovered something. The man 3 places up said, rather stiffly, that he had been told otherwise at his club. And Sarah Ray, at the head of the table, 70 years old and delighted, said yes, and you have been wrong all season, and now we know why. Charlotte Vane was 31 years old, and it was the first opinion she had offered in public since she was 26. She was asked back to Ray Hall 11 times in the following year. Stephen Roe came to Ainsdale on business 4 times in 1814, 6 times in 1815, and 11 times in 1816, and in 1817 he stopped pretending it was business. He never mentioned Ardvale. The old Earl died in 1819, and the consumptive boy in 1821, and Stephen Roe became the 9th Earl of Ardvale on a Tuesday and did not tell her until the Thursday, and when he did tell her, he apologised for it. And she laughed for the first time in about 4 years. They were married in the September of 1822 at St. Bride's at Ainsdale, and here is how it was done. There were no cards. There was no breakfast at a great house. The church was full at 9 in the morning with mill families in their working best, and the front left pew, the Ashby pew, was occupied by Sarah Dunn, aged 73, whose roof had gone in 1810, and who had been sent a man and a cart the same day, and by 6 of the Ainsdale weavers, put there by the bride's own hand and seated by her, 1 at a time, in front of everybody, which took 4 minutes and which not one person in that church misunderstood. Mistress, Kites, was in the second pew. Misty, Bree, came up from Leeds. Henry, who was 9, gave his mother away and took it extremely seriously. And the Dowager Duchess of Harrogate, who was 76 and had 4 months to live, sat across the aisle in the seat she had sat in at the christening and cried, which nobody had ever seen her do, and said afterward that she was tired. They had 11 years. He died in 1833 of a chest complaint he had picked up in a shipyard at 20 and never shaken, and she buried him at Whitby among his own people rather than at Ardvale among his title, because that is what he had asked for, and she was not a woman who negotiated with the dead. She lived until 1861 and ran the mills until she was 73. So, here is what this story is for. Everybody who tells it in the north tells it as the story of a duke who was ruined by his own steward, and it is not that. And the tellers who like a moral tell it as the story of a woman who got her revenge, and it is not that either. And she would have corrected you sharply if you had said so in her hearing. Charlotte Vane did not take one thing from Theodore Vane that had ever been his. She took back a marriage portion, 3 mills her grandfather built, and a child she bore. And she left him every acre and every stone and the name on the gate, And she did it with a notebook, a housekeeper's drawer, a bank clerk's copper plate, and 84 tenants who answered her letters because for 6 years she had answered theirs. The pew was never the point. The pew was only the day she stopped waiting. Because the truth she found out in that church, and the reason I wanted to tell you this one, is that a woman is never diminished by the seat somebody else is put in. She is diminished only for as long as she keeps hoping that the man who did it will one day turn round and see her. Charlotte Ashby hoped for 6 years, and it cost her 6 years. She stopped hoping on the 9th of March, and it took her 4 months to end it, and 31 years to build something that outlasted every person who had ever laughed at her father in a garden or at her opinions at a dinner table. Her worth was never in being chosen. It was in the ledger, in the letters answered in 3 days, in the 1,240 people who still had work in the winter of 1826, and in a front pew full of weavers on a Tuesday morning in September. And the man who walked out of that church without being asked to, who lost a godson and a place in the county and gained nothing at all by it that day, and who had asked for her once at 19 and been laughed at, and who never once in 17 years mentioned it to a living soul, he is the whole lesson, and the lesson is this. The people who value you when it costs them something are the only people whose valuation was ever real. Everyone else is just arranging the seating.